This conference will now be recorded. This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. So today's topic is on intrauterine death. Coming to the definition of intrauterine death, this is defined as death prior to complete expulsion or extraction of the products of conception from the mother after the period of viability, that is 20 weeks. We are taking 20 weeks of period as period of viability, and which is not induced or medically terminated. So the definition includes death which is before 20 weeks of gestation, complete expulsion or extraction of products of conception from the mother after 20 weeks of gestation, which is not induced. So why this 20 weeks mark is kept? Because death or any early intrauterine loss of the products of conception prior to 20 weeks of gestation, we will call it as miscarriage or abortion. If the period of gestation is not properly known, then you go with this definition, like fetal weight of more than 500 grams when gestational age is not known. So this is the definition of intrauterine death. So there are various etiological factors for intrauterine death. They are broadly classified into maternal, fetal, placental, iatrogenic, that is induced by our medical interventions, and idiopathic. So in detail, the maternal etiological factors are due to pregnancy related conditions, even maternal conditions like age, like early age of pregnancy, like teenage pregnancy or elderly pregnancy, and multigravidas, obesity. These are all maternal features or maternal factors which influence which increases the chances of intrauterine death. And other obstetric related complications are hypertensive disorders in pregnancy. This is due to vasculopathy or decreased uteroplacental flow to the fetus, which will cause intrauterine growth restriction or fetal growth restriction, followed by intrauterine death if it is not properly managed. And diabetes in pregnancy, either gestational diabetes, even overt diabetes, may cause intrauterine death. Gestational diabetes is having a higher risk of macrosomia in the late trimesters, which will increase the oxygen consumption of the fetus due to increased insulin-like growth factor. So this increased oxygen consumption outweighs the placental distribution to the fetus. Thereby, it increases the chance of intrauterine death. Therefore, in GDM patients, usually we will see late trimester stillborns. If it is an overt diabetic patient, usually overt diabetic patients will have vasculopathy, which also reduces the uteroplacental flow. Thereby, it causes decreased oxygen and nutrient supply to the fetus, which causes fetal growth restriction followed by fetal death. And maternal infections like viral infections, as you all know, the TORCH sequence of infections will cause various structural abnormalities or congenital malformations in the fetus, even placental changes, which are not actually survivable by the fetus, and we will lose, and there is a loss of fetus in the intrauterine period itself. Hyperpyrexia, that is temperature of more than 39.4 degrees centigrade, is also it will also damage the intrauterine homeostasis, and it will cause intrauterine death. And this Apla's and thrombophilias. Apla is antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. This is an autoimmune disease, and thrombophilias are other vasculopathies. All these will reduce the uteroplacental flow and thereby causes intrauterine death. Abnormal labor, if you see, if it is not properly monitored and managed, may go into prolonged labor, precipitated labor, and obstructed labor, which is having a higher risk of intrapartum death. And post-term pregnancy, if it is left even after 42 weeks of gestation, there is increased placental aging factors, like placental calcification increases, thereby reduces the placental flow to the fetus and causes intrauterine death or stillborn. So coming to the fetal causes include the chromosomal abnormalities, that is trisomies. Trisomy, actually Down syndrome is compatible with intrauterine period and even a little bit of early gestation. Therefore, you may see Down syndrome babies being born, but some chromosomal anomalies like trisomy 13, Edwards syndrome and all, these are incompatible with the survival. Therefore, we lose the fetus even in the intrauterine period, thereby causing intrauterine death. And major structural abnormalities and structural anomalies which are incompatible with life will lead to intrauterine death. And infections like intrauterine infections like chorioamnitis, viral infections, and even bacterial infection will cause intrauterine death. Rh incompatibility is an alloimmune hydrops, and non-immune hydrops will cause fetal anemia and hydropic changes in the fetus, and finally leads to intrauterine death. And finally, the fetal growth restriction due to uteroplacental insufficiency. If it is not managed properly, then you may lose the fetus. Coming to the placental causes, as I have already said, due to uteroplacental insufficiency, this is the major contribution of intrauterine death. Up to 40% it contributes to intrauterine death. And cord accidents like true knot and cord round the neck, which is tightly cord, nuchal cord, which is very tight, so that during intrapartum period it gets more tightened and it will give a strangulation feeling to the fetus and cause intrapartum death. And antepartum hemorrhage, even placenta previa and abruptio placenta are major causes of placental intrauterine death. When TTTS is a twin to twin transmission syndrome in twins, where you if the management is prolonged, or if it is not diagnosed at time, then you may lose one of the fetus in TTTS also. Iatrogenic causes are due to some interventions which the doctors or which the medical fraternity will do. These are ECV, external cephalic version. That is, if the presentation is breached, you will turn the fetus to cephalic presentation parabdominally. That we'll call it as external cephalic version. During this procedure, you have to continuously monitor the fetus, or after each movement, you have to monitor fetal heart, because there is high chance of fetal distress and fetal death. Even some drugs which are given due to fetal therapy are where you have to give very judicially monitoring for these drugs, because they are very teratogenic to the fetus. And idiopathic causes, again, it constitutes 30%, which is unknown. So after etiology, how you will diagnose a case of intrauterine death? How the patient will present? Usually the women will present with absence of fetal movements for the past 1 or 2 days, and she may give any history of trauma or bleeding. Then you have to rule out antepartum hemorrhage or any abruption, and she may give history of diabetes and hypertension and other risk factors which we have already seen in the maternal etiological factors. So from history itself, you will have an idea regarding the etiological factor of the intrauterine death, that is the cause of the intrauterine death. And signs, from the signs, if the fetal after fetal death, if the fetus is retained for prolonged period, you may see even the retrogression of the physiological changes of pregnancy, that is breast changes, and the physiological maternal changes will get regressed. On periabdominal examination, there is regression of fundal height. The fundal height is not appropriate for the gestational age. It is usually less than the gestational age, and you have to rule out the other causes which will cause this reduced fundal height, that is in transverse lie or in oligohydramnios. Even there is reduced fundal height, which is small for that gestational age. So you have to rule out the other causes too. So uterine tone, generally in pregnant women, the uterine tone will have a Braxton Hicks contraction. These are irregular contractions which maintains the uterine tone. But in an IUD case, you don't have a uterine tone. Uterus will be flaccid. And if you can, she don't perceive any fetal movements. Even on per abdominal examination, the doctors cannot perceive any fetal movements. And on Doppler examination, fetal heart sounds are absent. If you put an NST probe, that is the transducer for non-stress test, you will see a flat trace. There are no accelerations, no P2B2 variability, and no baseline, even no decelerations too. So these are the signs which you can see in a case of intrauterine death, that is retrogression of the fundal height. Fundal height is less than the period of gestation, decreased uterine tone, absent fetal movements, and absent fetal heart sounds with Doppler, and flat trace on NST. So after your signs, after eliciting these signs, what you want to do, you have to confirm the diagnosis. You can't tell based on these signs that this is a case of IUD, and you can't break the news to the women. So you have to confirm the diagnosis. How you will confirm the diagnosis? Again, you go for an imaging modality, that is ultrasonogram. So on ultrasonogram, if you see, if you don't see any fetal movements or any fetal heartbeat for a period of 10 minutes, then you can confirm the diagnosis as intrauterine death. That is no fetal movements and no fetal heart sounds for a period of 10 minutes. So you can see these occasional findings also, that is gross distortion of fetal anatomy. If the IUD happened for a prolonged period, then you may see the macerated changes with a tissue edema of skin, with a tissue edema and skin of more than 5 mm due to gross accumulation of fluid, an echogenic amniotic fluid, overlapping of skull bones due to liquefaction of brain matter. So the brain matter gets liquefied and it doesn't support the skull bones, thereby the skull bones will overlap. This sign is called as Spalding sign. Usually it is seen after 7 days of IUD. And the other uncommon things are thrombus in fetal heart and gas shadow in fetal heart, which is also called as Robert sign. This Robert sign is seen after 12 hours of IUD. So the occasional findings are Spalding sign, that is overlapping of skull bones due to liquefaction of brain matter, and maceration findings, soft tissue edema. Even you can see accumulation of fluid in the peritoneal pleural cavities too, and pericardial cavity too. And uncommon findings, the Robert sign and the thrombus in the fetal heart. This is the ultrasonogram picture of Spalding sign. You can see this overlapping of skull bones due to liquefaction of the brain matter. These are the skull bones which are getting overlapped. This sign takes 7 days to develop after IUD. See, previously when this ultrasonogram is not there, usually doctors used to take the straight X-ray abdomen. You can see there is hyperflexion of spine because loss of tone in the muscles of the fetus. Because fetus is not live, there is no tone in the muscles. Thereby hyperflexion of spine, sometimes hyperextension of neck. If you can see, there is crowding of ribs. Usually the ribs maintain their parallel structure in a live fetus, but in an IUD, there is crowding of ribs. Even Spalding and Robert sign is seen in straight X-ray abdomen. So after confirming the diagnosis by imaging technique, what all investigations you have to take? So general investigations and specific investigations. These are blood investigations and other amniotic fluid investigations. The general investigations are fasting blood sugar, random blood sugar, HbA1c to rule out any diabetes in pregnancy, blood grouping, KB test to rule out the alloimmunization, that is Rh incompatibility. If blood group of mother is Rh negative, then you have to take a KB test, that is how much of feto-maternal hemorrhage has happened, and is it really the amount of feto-maternal hemorrhage which actually led to IUD. And urine culture and urine toxicology should be done, and complete blood picture as a routine blood investigation. And coming to fetal investigations, amniocentesis to rule out other chromosomal and infections, and bacterial culture to rule out again infections, torch serology. And the special tests are thyroid function tests, APLA. APLA usually we'll do for early, for a recurrent pregnancy loss, 2 or more pregnancy losses, and if she gives a history of thrombus in the family and even gives a personal history of thrombosis in the veins or arteries, then you go for an APLA. And RFT, LFT as a routine monitoring of the patient. And you have to do a fibrinogen test, because if the fetus is retained for more than 4 weeks of gestation, then there is a high chance of coagulopathy in the mother. This is due to release of thromboplastin from the dead fetus into the maternal circulation, which enhances the fibrinolytic pathway and thereby again coagulation, and it depletes the platelet count. Thereby consumption coagulopathy happens and DIC. Finally, if it is not properly managed, again we will lose the mother also. Therefore, you have to monitor the patient with fibrinogen levels if you want to manage the case as a spontaneous progression. So after giving all these blood investigations and following delivery of the baby, you have to thoroughly examine the infant for any malformations or any anomalies, placental abnormalities, and cord abnormalities. And autopsy and chromosomal studies are strictly done in malformed fetus, and if the woman gives a recurrent stillbirth history, and if the parents are carriers for any translocations. So you have to do a chromosomal studies in malformed or congenitally if you see any malformed fetus, recurrent stillbirth history, and parents being carriers for any translocation. So with an IUD, what are the complications? There is a psychological upset for the women, because after getting pregnant, if the women don't get a viable baby, then she will definitely go into a psychological condition, either depression or psychosis. So that upset you have to manage properly. And if the fetus is left inside for prolonged period, usually a amniotic cavity is an aseptic area, but if there is rupture of membranes, there is a high chance of infection. And if the fetus is left for prolonged period, that is more than 4 weeks of gestation, there is high chance of consumption coagulopathy, as I've already said, which we call it as DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation. And during labor, you have other complications like uterine inertia, retained placenta, and thereby postpartum hemorrhage. So how you'll manage this case? So coming to, before getting into the proper management, we should know the steps to prevent this IUD. So how you will prevent this IUD? If you know the risk factors, you have to start the management from preconception itself. So you have to start from preconceptional counseling so that you can diagnose or identify any risk factor as early as possible, and you can initiate the treatment. If there is any fetal growth restriction, you can follow her with fetal surveillance, and you can finally decide when to terminate the pregnancy. So management goes with either spontaneous or induced termination of the pregnancy. So if you go for an induction, if it is less than 24 weeks of gestation, you have to prime the cervix, because cervical changes usually won't be favorable for normal delivery if it is prior to 24 weeks of gestation. So you have to prime the cervix. Priming the cervix means to induce the cervical changes with misoprostol, that is PGE1. If it is more than 24 weeks, some women will have a favorable cervix. Then you can augment or you can induce uterine contraction with oxytocin. If again after 24 weeks of gestation, if it is an unfavorable cervix, and you have to prime the cervix with prostaglandins or mechanical methods. So if you go with the misoprostol and oxytocin delivery, there is 14.8 hours of induction delivery time. If you start with the misoprostol, and finally for the delivery of the death fetus, it takes 14.8 hours average. So how much dose you will give? How much dose of misoprostol you have to put according to gestational age, because the receptors are more if the gestation age is more. Thereby you will reduce the dose of the misoprostol. So from 13 to 26 weeks of gestation, you'll go with 200 micrograms of misoprostol per vaginally every 4 to 6 hours. You have to repeat it. If it is more than 26 weeks of gestation, from up to 28 weeks, you go with 100 micrograms. If it is more than 28 weeks, you will take it as a term pregnancy, and you will induce with 25 micrograms of misoprostol. So these are the various mechanical methods. Mechanical methods of induction, as you all know, that these are hygroscopic dilators. When you keep these dilators in the cervical os, usually they will increase in diameter by absorbing the water, and they will induce the cervical opening, cervical dilatation. And balloon catheter is a Foley's balloon catheter. You can introduce a Foley's catheter into the cervical os up to the internal os, and you have to dilate the balloon. it will induce the cervical dilatation. These are the various mechanical methods to induce. So this is the proper scheme of management of an IUD. You can, if you diagnose a case of IUD, you can wait for spontaneous expulsion, because 80% of cases or 80% of women, they'll go for a spontaneous expulsion after an IUD within 2 weeks of period. So if there is any psychological factor, if the mother needs a psychological support, if she can't wait for 2 weeks of gestation, if there is a rupture of membranes with infections, and if the fibrinogen level is falling, as I've already said, patient may go into a consumption coagulopathy. And if it is retained for more than 2 weeks, if the labor is not initiated for even after 2 weeks, then you have to go for a medical induction of labor. These are the 4 common conditions we'll go for a medical induction of labor. First, you have to confirm the diagnosis, and you have to break the news to the women, and you have to psychologically support her, and you will tell her that up to 2 weeks it may get spontaneously expelled. If she is psychologically upset, and if she can't take it for 2 weeks of gestation, if there is rupture of membranes with infection, and if there is a falling fibrinogen level, which increases the chances of DIC in mother, if the mother's health is at risk, and if it is retained for more than 2 weeks, then you will go for a medical induction. You will admit the patient in the hospital, and you go for a medical induction. As I've already said, if it is less than 24 weeks of gestation, you will go with the cervical priming to induce cervical changes with prostaglandins followed by oxytocin. If it is more than 24 weeks of gestation, you will do a pervaginal examination. If the cervix is favorable, directly you will induce the uterine contractions with oxytocin. If it is not favorable, again you go with the protocol of misoprostol followed by oxytocin. This is if it is cervix is favorable, directly go with the oxytocin infusion. If it fails, you can repeat the prostaglandin and repeat the oxytocin the next day. The cervix is unfavorable, go with the PG-11 misoprostol, either vaginally or orally. Every 4th hourly you have to repeat, or PGE2 gel is available. You can use it for every 6 hourly for 3 doses. If this fails, you can just trial with the oxytocin infusion, and you have to deliver the baby. After that, you have to go with an evaluation of stillbirth and the psychological management of the women. If the normal delivery, this is all we are managing. Usually in an IUD case, you will go with the maximum you will try for a normal vaginal delivery. But if it doesn't happen, then you have to go for a laparotomy and hysterotomy to take the baby out, and to without the maternal health getting into risk. So after delivery, you have to examine the fetus. So postpartum examination includes clinical photography, radiological images, and autopsy. Coming to clinical examination, you have to take a photograph of the infant in 3 views, that is in frontal, dorsal, and the lateral views. And you have to see for any changes of macerations. Maceration is the changes that you can see on the skin, where the skin becomes softened due to prolonged soaking in the amniotic fluid. This is the maceration changes. Morse fetus intrauterina is a fetal demise during pregnancy, that is during antepartum period. This shows maceration changes, because there is during antepartum period, if the fetal death happens, there is a prolonged there is prolonged soaking or softening of the skin due to amniotic fluid. Thereby, it shows the signs of maceration. Morse fetus intrapartum, that is death occurs during delivery, that is intrapartum intrauterine death. This doesn't show any maceration changes, because the fresh stillborn fetus, you will see after delivery, you can see the fetus as a normal fetus without any signs of life. That is no fetal heart, no fetal movement, no umbilical vein pulsations. On macroscopic appearance, grossly, the skin, usually you can see the bullae or skin slippage due to prolonged soaking for 4 to 6 hours. If you can see the head skull bones get collapsed, and you can see the overlapping of skull bones due to liquefaction of brain matter. And internal organs, usually they will become reddish discoloration due to hemolysis, and yellowish brown discoloration with retention for prolonged several weeks. And You'll see a softening of connective tissues and joint laxity. This is the gross changes you can see an IUD case. You can see here, see this fetus looks very flaccid with joint laxity and decreased tone and skull bones, collapsing of the skull bones and skin slippage with occasional blisters. Coming to radiological examination, one should take a single anteroposterior plane radiograph of whole body including hands and feet with limbs extended in anatomical position. Finally, the autopsy is done to estimate the time of the death of the dead fetus or the stillborn fetus. You can see the desquamation of the skin of more than 1 centimeter and red or brown discoloration of the umbilical cord if it is more than 6 hours. And desquamation involves the skin of face, back and abdomen if it is more than 12 hours, and desquamation of 5% of body surface or more if it is more than 18 hours, and moderate to severe desquamation if it is more than 24 hours, and mummification is if the dead fetus is retained for more than 2 weeks. This is the early death. You can see the reddish brown discoloration of the umbilical cord in the first picture. Thereby it is 4 to 6 hours. The second picture, desquamation of more than 1 centimeters, which is involving face and neck and abdomen. Thereby it is more than 8 to 10 hours. This is desquamation of 25% of the body with skin discoloration, that is more than 18 hours, and skin slippage with cranial decompression more than 36 hours. This is external appearance on autopsy. If you do a complete postmortem examination, there will be exudation of fluid and hemolyzed blood into the all cavities, pleural, pericardial and peritoneal cavities. And the fetus will look edematous like eye drops, and later progressive loss of fluid. If the fetus is retained for more than 2 weeks, then the mummification changes will see. So after the examination of the newborn, you have to examine the placenta and the cord. Placenta, you have to look for any retroplacental clot to rule out any abruption, because concealed abruption you can't rule out in the antepartum period. So after placental delivery, if there is a retroplacental clot, you can rule out concealed abruption, any subcensurate lobe placenta, any abnormal placentation or any abnormal insertion of cord to the placenta, that is battledore or circumvallate placenta. Any infarctions you can see, any calcification changes you can see on the placenta. And coming to the cords, true knots on the cord. This picture shows a true knot and the nuchal cord, that is cord round the neck, which is tightly placed, which may lead to strangulation of the fetus and IUD during intrapartum period. So finally, after examination, you will go with the psychological management of the women. You can't leave the women after an IUD, because this is a you have to deal it very sensitively, and if needed, you have to go for a psychological psychiatric consultation if she goes for a depression, postpartum depression and or postpartum psychosis, and you have to treat her in the hospital itself even before discharge. And if the patient, if the IUD happens in the late second trimester or in the third trimester, after expulsion of the fetus, the women may have increased breast engorgement due to lactation, that you have to suppress lactation with bromocriptine or cabergoline. So how you'll manage a pregnancy after a stillbirth? If she gets pregnant again, she will have all these previous stillbirth factors in the pregnancy, and she might have all the psychological upset. And how you will manage a pregnancy after a stillbirth? So if the patient comes even prior to the conception itself, you have to take a detailed medical and obstetric history to rule out any medical and obstetrical complications she had in the prior pregnancy. And you have to review evaluation of the prior stillbirth. If the cause of the stillborn is known, then you have to evaluate the cause and determination of any recurrence of risk. Some medical and obstetrical complications may recur in the next pregnancy, and you have to determine how much recurrence risk is there, and you have to counsel the patient accordingly, and discuss the recurrence of comorbid obstetric condition. Even if the recurrence of the prior stillborn, if the recurrence is not that much significant, but she might have a comorbid obstetric complications which you have to counsel her even prior to the conception itself. If she is a chronic smoker, you will advise her to quit smoking. If she is an alcoholic, you will advise her to quit alcohol. And if she is obese, preconceptionally, you will advise her to maintain an optimum weight. And genetic counseling, if she or her husband or in the family they have a genetic conditions. And you have to go for a diabetic screen with HbA1c and fasting blood sugars, and thrombophilia screen if she is having a recurrent pregnancy losses with antiphospholipid antibodies. And you have to support and reassurance that if the cause of the stillborn or if the cause of the stillborn is predictable, and if it is a treatable cause, you have to reassure her for proper management in this pregnancy itself. So what you will do in the first trimester? First trimester, even before conception, you will rule out all the risk factors. If there are any risk factors, you will promptly manage the case, and you go for a dating sonography to know the appropriate gestation of the fetus. That you will take at 8 to 11 weeks of gestation, and you will properly know the dating sonography is properly knowing the gestational age of the fetus. And first trimester biochemical screen like with double marker and nuchal translucency that you will do prior to 13 weeks plus 6 days of gestation. That is pregnancy associated plasma protein A and HCG levels along with nuchal translucency. They will give 90 to 95%. This is having a 90 to 95% of sensitivity. Thereby you can rule out some congenital anomalies. And you have to support the patient and reassure her that the pregnancy is going well. And coming to second trimester, you will go for a fetal proper anatomical survey, that is TFA scan. Targeted scan at 18 to 20 weeks of gestation, so that you can rule 90 to 95 to 98% of congenital anomalies in this scan. And if the dual marker is abnormal, you go with a triple or quadruple marker or chromosomal anomalies if she have a positive family history. And uterine artery Doppler studies at 20 to 24 weeks of gestation. If there is any notching or if there is any decreased diastolic flow in the uterine artery, the patient may have high chances of hypertensive disorders or decreased uteroplacental flow. Thereby, you can manage the case in the at the earliest as possible. And third trimester, again, you go for a fetal biometry scan at 7 months of gestation or 28 weeks of gestation, whether the fetal growth is maintained or not. And you will advise the patient regarding the daily fetal movement count, so that she can have she can monitor the fetal movements daily. If there is any reduced fetal movement, she have to report immediately. And antepartum surveillance is started at 32 weeks of gestation, because autonomous nervous system will be developed by 32 weeks of gestation. Thereby you can go for an NST test after 32 weeks of gestation if she is having any comorbid or risk factors. In fetal kick counts, how you will advise her fetal kick counts? After every meal, she have to she have to count the fetal movements for 1 hour, and if the movements are less than 4, then she has to report. Or for a total of 12 hours, she should get a minimum of 10 movements. Coming to the delivery, if everything goes fine, you will electively induce the patient at 39 weeks of gestation, or even prior if she gives a previous stillbirth of at a earlier gestations. And delivery before 39 weeks is done after complete documentation of fetal lung maturity by lecithin and sphingomyelin ratios. If you are going to deliver the patient prior to 34 weeks of gestation, just give a dose of antenatal corticosteroid, which will enhance the fetal lung maturity. If you're planning to deliver her by less than 32 weeks of gestation, you have to give magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection. So, any doubts? So summarizing this intrauterine death, first patient, you have to go with the symptoms which are said by the patient, followed by signs. You have to confirm the diagnosis by ultrasonography, and you have to rule out any etiological factors even from the history, signs, and the ultrasound features, followed by proper proper management, either spontaneous or induction of a labor. After that, following delivery, proper examination of the fetus along with the placenta, cord and fetal examination. And after that, you have to psychologically manage the patient regarding the psychological stress which you would have undergone. After that, management of next pregnancy with a history of stillbirth. So that's all for today. We'll leave then.